Hi guys, imagine finding a book that doesn't just hold knowledge but holds the literal power of creation and life itself. A book that led a simple medieval shopkeeper to crack the code of immortality and infinite wealth, leaving behind an empty grave that remains one of history's greatest unsolved mysteries. We're about to unravel the incredibly true and bizarre story of Nicholas Flamel, the man who allegedly created the Philosopher's Stone, cheated death, and is rumoured to still walk among us today, watching the world change while he remains exactly the same. This isn't just a story about magic, it's a detective story spanning centuries, involving codes, angels, and a quest that drove men mad. So buckle up, because we're going all the way back to the beginning to see how it all started. But before we begin, for those who enjoy slow, thoughtful stories about legendary figures, hit like, subscribe, and share in the comments which personality or historical figure you'd like me to cover next. And tell me, where are you watching from? I'm always curious to see the different places my viewers are from. To understand the Alchemist, we first have to understand the man and the world that forged him, which was far from the glossy fantasy we often see in movies, because the Paris of the 14th century was a place of stark contrasts. A labyrinth of winding, mud-slicked streets where the stench of open sewers mingled with the scent of incense drifting from the great cathedrals. Nicholas Flamel was born around 1330, likely in the seemingly insignificant area of Pontoise, but his destiny lay in the heart of Paris, where he didn't start as a wizard or a sorcerer but as a scrivener, a man of letters in an age where literacy was a superpower. He set up his small shop near the church of Saint-Jacques de la Boucherie, a bustling, noisy district where butchers shouted their wares and students from the university argued philosophy in the taverns. Flamel was a copyist and a bookseller, a profession that required patience, precision, and a deep respect for the written word. And it was here, surrounded by stacks of parchment, pots of iron, gall ink, and the scratching of quills, that he built a modest but respectable life. He wasn't alone in this. He married a widow named Perenelle, a woman of intelligence and distinct capability who brought her own wealth and sharp mind to the marriage, forming a partnership that would become legendary, not just for its romance, but for its shared obsession with the arcane. They were normal, devout people, attending Mass, giving to the poor, and running their business, giving absolutely no sign that they were about to stumble upon the most dangerous secret in human history. The turning point didn't come with a bang, but with a dream. A vivid, unshakable vision where an angel appeared to Nicholas, holding a magnificent ancient book bound in copper, and the angel spoke to him, saying, "Look well at this book, Nicholas. At first, you will understand nothing in it, neither you nor any other man. But one day you will see in it that which no other man will see." This dream haunted him, lingering in the back of his mind like a ghost until the day Destiny actually walked into his shop in the form of a desperate stranger looking to sell an old manuscript for a mere 2 florins. As soon as Nicholas laid eyes on it, his heart must have hammered against his ribs because it was the exact book from his dream. A large gilded volume that felt heavy with age and power, distinct from the Latin Bibles and legal texts he dealt with daily. The cover was not made of paper or parchment, but of distinct, delicate bark, which he believed to be from a young orange tree, engraved with strange, intricate diagrams that seemed to move if you stared at them too long. Inside, the pages were not paper, but fine, smooth rind, and the text was written with an iron point in a language he couldn't read, a script that looked like ancient Greek or Hebrew, but was twisted into ciphers that defied immediate translation. This was the Book of Abraham the Mage, a text that claimed to contain the secrets of transmutation, the ability to turn base metals into pure gold, and perhaps the recipe for the elixir of life. However, owning the book was one thing. Understanding it was an entirely different battle, as the text was guarded by complex allegorical images: a serpent swallowing its tail, a flower on a mountaintop shaken by the wind, and terrible dragons fighting each other. Images that were not just decoration, but the instructions themselves. Flamel knew he held a miracle in his hands. a key to the universe's source code, but he was locked out, staring at a door he couldn't open. He spent hours, then days, then weeks poring over the pages, neglecting his business, his eyes straining by candlelight as he tried to match the symbols to every known alphabet in his collection. But the book remained silent, a stubborn vault of wisdom that refused to yield. He didn't tell anyone about the book at first, fearing he might be branded a heretic or a madman, so he kept it hidden beneath the counter, bringing it out only when the shop was empty, tracing the lines of the illustrations, feeling the cold copper of the binding, and sensing that his life had irrevocably split into before and after. This was the beginning of the obsession, the moment the scrivener died and the alchemist began to stir, fueled by a mystery that was far too big for one man to solve alone, forcing him to realize that if he wanted to unlock the secret of immortality, he would have to venture far beyond the safety of his Parisian bookshop and dive into the shadowy underground of esoteric knowledge that permeated Europe. The book was a call to adventure, but it was also a curse, a puzzle that demanded to be solved, and Nicholas Flamel, the quiet man of letters, was now the keeper of a fire that would eventually consume his entire existence and rewrite history. For 21 long years, Nicholas Flamel lived in the agonizing shadow of the book, a period of time that would have broken a lesser man's spirit. But for him, it was a crucible that tested his patience and his sanity as he tried to bridge the gap between ignorance and enlightenment. The volume consisted of 3 parts, each containing 7 leaves, a structure that was clearly significant, likely referencing the Holy Trinity and the 7 days of creation, or the 7 known metals of alchemy. But the logic remained tantalizingly out of reach. On the first page there was a painting of a young man with winged feet, holding a caduceus intertwined with serpents, running across a field with an open mouth as if shouting a warning to the winds, while behind him an old man with an hourglass on his head and a scythe in his hands tried to cut off his feet, a clear allegorical representation of Mercury and time, or perhaps the volatile nature of the alchemical mercury that needs to be fixed before it evaporates. Flamel spent his nights tracing these figures, his fingers stained with ink, trying to find a correlation between the images and the text, but every breakthrough turned out to be a dead end, leading him into a maze of false starts and confusion. Desperate for a clue, he eventually did something incredibly risky. He carefully copied the figures from the book onto fresh parchment and displayed them in his shop, hoping that a visiting scholar or a traveller might recognize them and offer a hint. This was a dangerous gamble because showing alchemical symbols openly could attract the wrong kind of attention from the church or envious rivals, but his desperation outweighed his fear. However, the plan backfired spectacularly, as the only people who commented on the drawings were fools who interpreted them as ordinary religious icons or nonsense, mocking Flamel for his strange artistic tastes. And for a long time, the only person who shared his burden was his wife, Perenelle. She was not merely a spectator in this drama. She became his confidant and equal partner, studying the pages with the same fervour, her intuition often spotting patterns that Nicholas had missed. And together they wept over the silent pages that promised eternal life but delivered only frustration. They realized that the text was likely written in a coded form of ancient Hebrew, or a dialect used by Jewish mystics, known as the Kabbalah, which presented a massive geopolitical problem for the couple, because at that time in France, the Jewish population had been persecuted and largely expelled by royal decree. This meant that finding a scholar in Paris who could read the text without turning Flamel over to the authorities was next to impossible, forcing him to look beyond the borders of his home country toward a place where cultures still intermingled. Rumours had long circulated about the learned men of Spain, specifically in the regions where Jewish, Islamic and Christian scholars exchanged knowledge in relative peace, preserving the ancient wisdom that had been lost to the rest of Europe. After 2 decades of futility, Flamel made the life-altering decision to undertake a pilgrimage to Santiago de Compostela, the shrine of St. James in Spain, which was a perfect cover for his true mission. To the outside world, he was a pious man fulfilling a religious vow, a common practice that would grant him safe passage through dangerous territories. But in reality, he was a spy on a mission of industrial espionage, hunting for a key to unlock the universe. He prepared for the journey with meticulous care, knowing that the road was fraught with bandits, disease, and the harsh elements of the Pyrenees Mountains. He couldn't take the precious book with him. It was far too valuable and conspicuous to risk losing on the road. So he made exact, painstaking copies of the most critical figures and the incomprehensible text, hiding them within his modest traveller's robes. Leaving the original book in the safe hands of Perenelle, he said his goodbyes, donning the scallop shell symbol of the pilgrim and grabbing his walking staff, stepping out of his shop and away from the life he knew. As he walked out of Paris, leaving the spires of the cathedral behind, he was no longer just a scrivener. He was an initiate crossing the threshold into the unknown, driven by a hope that was as fragile as the parchment he carried. The journey to Spain was grueling, a physical manifestation of the alchemical process itself. Calcination, the burning away of the ego and the softening of the soul, as he trudged through rain and mud, sleeping in crowded hostels or under the stars, his mind constantly revolving around the enigma waiting for him back in Paris. He arrived in Spain not as a conqueror, but as a humble seeker, visiting the holy shrines to maintain his cover while his eyes scanned every crowd, every synagogue, and every gathering of learned men for someone, anyone, who might hold the cipher. He spent months searching, showing his copied figures to various scholars who claimed to know the secrets of the art. But most were charlatans or pretenders who knew less than he did, and despair began to set in as he realized he might have travelled hundreds of miles for nothing. The weight of failure pressed down on him as he prepared to return home, his feet sore and his heart heavy, believing that the secret of the book was destined to remain buried forever, unaware that a chance encounter in a dusty corner of Lyon was about to change the trajectory of his life and the history of alchemy forever. It was in the ancient city of Leon, a place where the sun beat down on stone walls that had stood since the Romans, that the universe finally decided to blink back at Nicholas Flamel. He was preparing for the long defeated trek back to Paris, sitting in a crowded merchant's inn, when fate introduced him to a man who had become the pivot point of his entire existence. Through a casual acquaintance, a merchant from Boulogne, Flamel was introduced to an elderly physician known as Master Canche, a man of profound intellect and deep, weary eyes who was a converted Jew, living in the shadow of the forced conversions that had swept through Spain. Flamel, sensing a kindred spirit, or perhaps driven by a final burst of reckless hope, decided to show the physician the copies of the figures he had been carrying next to his skin for months, unrolling the parchment on the rough wooden table between them. The reaction was instantaneous and electric. As soon as Canche's eyes landed on the drawings, the Virgin and the serpents, the strange rod, the desert landscape, he didn't laugh or scoff. Instead, he grabbed Flamel's arm with a grip of surprising strength, his face draining of colour before flushing with an intense, feverish excitement. He recognised the symbols immediately, not as nonsense, but as the fragmented keys to the Ash Mezareph, a legendary lost text believed to have been written by Abraham the Jew, a patriarch of their people, containing the ultimate secrets of the Kabbalah, which had been thought lost to the ravages of time and persecution. Canches had spent his life hearing whispers of this book, dreaming of its existence, and now a humble French scrivener was sitting before him, claiming to have the original volume sitting in a cupboard in Paris. The physician explained that the figures were not just pictures, but instructions on how to prepare the first matter, the chaotic substance from which the philosopher's stone is born, and he began to decipher the hidden meanings right there in the inn, his voice a low, urgent whisper to avoid overhead ears. He explained that the serpents represented the dual nature of Mercury, the fixed and the volatile, and that the seemingly random Latin words were actually anagrams and codes that required a specific key to unravel. For Flamel, this was the moment the blindfold was ripped away. Suddenly, the gibberish he had stared at for 20 years began to sing, transforming into a coherent, logical language of chemistry and spirit. Master Canches was so overcome with the desire to see the original book that he immediately abandoned his life in Lyon. pledging to accompany Flamel back to France, ignoring his advanced age and the severe dangers of the road. Thus began one of the most significant road trips in history, a journey where every mile was a lesson, as the old master poured a lifetime of esoteric knowledge into Flamel's eager mind, teaching him how to read the silence between the words and the geometry behind the drawings. They travelled north, dodging bandits and avoiding the prying eyes of the Inquisition, bonded by the shared thrill of a discovery that could change the world. However, the story of alchemy is rarely without tragedy, as if the universe demands a price for such forbidden knowledge. As they crossed into France and reached the city of Orléans, seemingly within striking distance of Paris and the prize that awaited them, Master Canche fell violently ill, his body failing him just as his spirit was soaring highest. It was a cruel twist of fate. The man who held the key to the lock was dying on the doorstep. Flamel nursed him with the tenderness of a son, listening to his final, gasping instructions, trying to absorb every last drop of wisdom before the light went out. Canches died in Orleans, leaving Flamel heartbroken and alone once more, but with a crucial difference. He was no longer blind. He buried his friend and mentor in the Church of the Holy Cross in Orleans, a solemn affair where he likely promised to finish the work they had started together. He returned to Paris not as the confused pilgrim who had left, but as an initiate who had glimpsed the mechanism of creation, carrying the grief of his friend's death as fuel for the fire that would soon burn in his laboratory. He reunited with Perenelle, who must have seen the change in his eyes immediately, and laid the figures out on the table again. But this time, when he looked at the Book of Abraham the Mage, it didn't mock him. It spoke to him. The pilgrimage was over, the master was dead, but the great work was finally truly about to begin. Armed with the partial keys provided by the late Master Canches, Nicholas and Perenelle locked the doors of their home on the Rue des Écrivains and turned their attention inward, transforming their domestic life into a secret laboratory where the air grew thick with the acrid smells of sulphur, mercury and charcoal. This was no longer a hobby, but a dangerous obsession that consumed every spare coin and every waking hour. A 3-year descent into the physical reality of the great work, which was far more grueling than the philosophical study of books. They were operating in a time before safety goggles or fume hoods, manipulating toxic substances that could drive a person mad or kill them slowly. Mercury, or quicksilver as it was known, is a neurotoxin that seeps into the skin and lungs, yet they handled it daily, believing it to be the seed of all metals. The process described in the Book of Abraham was a delicate dance of heating and cooling, a cycle of solvet coagula, dissolve and coagulate, where the matter had to be broken down into a chaotic black putrefaction, known as the nigredo, before it could be purified into the white stage, or albedo. For 3 long years they were plagued by errors, often spending weeks cooking a mixture only to realise the temperature had been slightly too high, or the seal on the vessel, the hermetic seal, had cracked, ruining the entire batch and forcing them to start over from scratch. It was a test of faith that would have shattered most marriages, but Perenelle was the steel in Nicholas's spine, managing the furnaces with a steady hand and interpreting the subtle colour changes in the glass retorts that signalled the progress of the reaction. They lived in constant fear of discovery, for the smoke and strange odours wafting from their chimney could have easily alerted suspicious neighbours or the authorities, leading to accusations of counterfeiting or witchcraft, crimes punishable by death at the stake. They worked mostly at night, huddled over the glowing embers of the Athanor, the alchemical furnace, watching for the signs described by the ancient text, the appearance of the raven's head for the black stage, or the white swan for the purification. Finally, after 1,000 days of failure, the breakthrough came on a cold winter day, specifically Monday, January 17th, 1382, around noon, a date Flamel recorded with the precision of a man who knew he was making history. Alone in the house with Perenelle, he took a half-pound of mercury, a liquid metal that had frustrated alchemists for millennia, and projected a small piece of the white stone they had finally managed to synthesize onto it. The reaction was bubbling and violent, a chemical wrestling match inside the crucible, but when the smoke cleared and the vessel cooled, the liquid quicksilver was gone. In its place lay a solid, gleaming lump of pure virgin silver, brighter and softer than anything mined from the earth. They stared at it in disbelief, testing it, weighing it, and perhaps cutting into it to ensure the transmutation wasn't just surface-deep plating, but it was solid silver through and through. They had done the impossible. They had manipulated the atomic structure of matter centuries before science would even admit atoms existed. This was the first level of success, the creation of the white elixir which could transmute base metals into silver, proving that the book was true and that the late Master Kanches had not died in vain. But silver, while valuable, was not the ultimate goal. The true prize, the red elixir, the Philosopher's Stone capable of creating gold and granting eternal life, was the next and final step, and having tasted success, Nicholas and Perenelle were now ready to push the boundaries of nature even further, risking everything for the final transformation that would secure their legacy forever. The success with the silver was a triumph that would have satisfied any ordinary ambition, proving that the fundamental laws of nature could be bent by human will. But Nicholas and Perenelle were no longer ordinary people. They were alchemists standing on the precipice of the absolute, and silver was merely the opening act for the main event. They returned to the furnaces with a renewed intensity, knowing that the final stage, the rubedo or red work, was the most volatile and dangerous phase of all, requiring a precise escalation of heat that could easily shatter their vessels or ruin the months of preparation. The goal was to push the white stone further, cooking it until it passed through the phase of citrinitas, a yellowing stage, and finally achieved the deep, translucent red of the perfect Philosopher's Stone, the substance that could transmute base metal into pure gold and, according to legend, cure all human illnesses. For 3 tense months following the silver transmutation, they tended the fire, watching the colours shift inside the glass egg, holding their breath as the matter darkened and then brightened, praying that the glass would hold the immense spiritual and physical pressure building inside it. History records the exact moment the miracle occurred with the specificity of a birth certificate. It was April 25th, 1382, at exactly 5 o'clock in the afternoon, as the evening light was beginning to slant through the shutters of their Parisian home. With Perenelle standing by his side, Nicholas performed the projection again, this time using the red stone upon a half-pound of mercury, and as the reaction settled and the crucible cooled, the heavy, toxic liquid had vanished, replaced by a lump of gold that was purer, softer, and more brilliant than anything that had ever come out of a mine. They tested it, hammered it, and likely even tasted it, but there was no denying the reality. They had cracked the code of the universe and effectively printed unlimited wealth in their basement. In that quiet room, amidst the smell of charcoal and sweat, they had become the richest couple in Europe, possessing a power that kings and emperors would kill entire armies to obtain. But with this godlike power came a terrifying realization that hits every lottery winner, but magnified 1,000 times. How do you hide the fact that you have just won the cosmic jackpot in a city where tax collectors, thieves, and the Inquisition are always watching? If they suddenly started buying castles or wearing silk, questions would be asked. The king would demand their secrets, and they would likely end up tortured in a dungeon until they gave up the recipe. So, Nicholas and Flamel devised a brilliant strategy of stealth wealth, a method of money laundering that was ahead of its time, deciding to hide their fortune in plain sight by becoming the most generous philanthropists Paris had ever seen. They didn't expand their own home or change their simple way of life. Instead, they poured their gold into the church and the public good, funding the construction of 14 hospitals, 3 chapels, and 7 churches in Paris alone, not to mention their contributions in Boulogne. This was a masterstroke of diversion because, in the medieval mind, such extreme charity wasn't seen as suspicious wealth, but as extreme piety, a sign that God was blessing their humble business because of their good hearts. They essentially bought a divine insurance policy, making themselves untouchable, because they were the city's greatest benefactors, loved by the poor and respected by the clergy. Among their most famous contributions was the renovation of the Cemetery of the Innocents, a massive, gruesome public grave in Paris, where Flamel commissioned the construction of a magnificent arcade, a row of arches decorated with strange, complex sculptures. To the average passerby, these were just religious scenes, but to the initiated they were a stone book, a public display of the alchemical secrets he'd learned, hiding the recipe for the Philosopher's Stone in the carvings of angels, dragons, and skeletons, mocking the ignorance of the crowds who walked beneath them every day. Flamel had turned the streets of Paris into his own personal grimoire, leaving clues that would puzzle scholars for centuries, ensuring that while he walked around in his modest scrivener's robes, playing the part of the humble shopkeeper, he was secretly the puppet master of a legacy that was written in gold and stone. The scrivener had become the master, and the gold was real. But the true question remained. Had they also used the stone to brew the elixir of life? And were they already beginning to stop the clock on their own mortality, while the rest of Paris aged and died around them? The epicenter of Nicholas Flamel's cryptic legacy was not his home, but the Cemetery of the Innocents, a place that served as the beating, paradoxical heart of medieval Paris, where the line between the living and the dead was virtually non-existent. It was a sprawling, chaotic enclosure where the soil was so packed with bodies that the ground level had risen significantly above the surrounding streets, and the overflow of bones was stacked in open charnel houses that lined the walls, creating a macabre gallery of skulls and femurs that stared down at the living. Yet this wasn't a place of quiet mourning. It was a bustling social hub where merchants sold their wares, prostitutes plied their trade, and lovers met for trysts amidst the stench of decomposition, a stark reminder of mortality that Flamel chose as the canvas for his greatest masterpiece. He poured his alchemical gold into this grim theatre, commissioning the construction of the fourth arch in the cemetery's charnel house, a structure that would become the most analysed piece of stonework in the history of the occult. On this arch, he ordered a mural to be painted, and sculptures to be carved that ostensibly depicted religious scenes to satisfy the church and the casual observer. Images of the resurrection, the day of judgment, and angels saving souls. However, to the trained eye of an initiate, these images were a blatant, glorious transcription of the Book of Abraham the Mage, a step-by-step visual manual for creating the Philosopher's Stone exposed to the open air for anyone with the wisdom to see it. Flamel himself was depicted on the arch, kneeling alongside Perenelle at the feet of St. Paul, portraying themselves as humble donors, but the surrounding imagery told a different, more volatile story. There were depictions of a man black as a Moor, representing the nigredo, or the initial stage of putrefaction where the matter turns black and rots. There were dragons gnawing at each other, symbolising the corrosive solvents used to break down the metals, and there were strange hermaphroditic figures that represented the rebis, the dual nature of the stone that unites opposites. He even included the colour codes of the great work, black, white and red, woven into the frescoes, ensuring that the recipe was complete for those who knew the language of colour. For centuries this arch became a mecca for aspiring alchemists, who would travel from across Europe to stand in the mud of the cemetery, sketching Flamel's hieroglyphs in their notebooks, trying to reverse engineer the miracle he had achieved. It was the ultimate act of hiding in plain sight. While thousands of Parisians walked past that arch every day, haggling over the price of bread or cloth, they were blindly ignoring the instructions for infinite wealth and eternal life that were literally hanging over their heads. Flamel had transformed the cemetery into a stone book, turning the city's relationship with death on its head by planting the seeds of immortality right in the middle of a graveyard. This wasn't just charity. It was arrogance and altruism mixed together, a way for Flamel to preserve the knowledge that had almost been lost, ensuring that even if his original book was destroyed or stolen, the secret would survive in the architecture of Paris itself. He also funded the portal of the Church of Saint-Jacques de la Boucherie, adding more symbols and carvings that linked back to the cemetery, creating a treasure map across the city that only the worthy could navigate. The irony was profound. The man who had supposedly conquered death was spending his fortune beautifying the resting place of the dead, perhaps laughing softly to himself at the grand joke of it all. By embedding the secrets in stone, Flamel ensured that his legend would outlast the fragile parchment of the books he copied, cementing his status not just as a wealthy burgher, but as the guardian of a truth so powerful it had to be camouflaged as religious art to survive the scrutiny of a world that wasn't ready for it. As the 14th century bled into the 15th, the world around Nicholas and Perenelle continued its chaotic march of wars and plagues. But inside the house on the Rue des Écrivains, time seemed to move at a different, quieter pace. However, the narrative of their lives took a sharp, tragic turn in 1397, a year that would test the very foundation of Flamel's existence. Perenelle, his partner in the art, the woman who had stared into the crucible with him and shared the heavy burden of immortality, died. Or at least, that is what the official records tell us. To the public, it was the heartbreaking end of a long, pious union. Nicholas buried her with all the solemnity and grief of a devoted husband, laying her to rest in the cemetery of the innocents, the very place they had transformed with their alchemical art. Her death sent shockwaves through the local community, not just because they were loved, but because for those who suspected the truth about the Flamels, it presented a glaring paradox. If they possessed the elixir of life, why did Perenelle succumb to the grave? Skeptics would argue this proves they were frauds, simply lucky merchants who told a good story, but the true believers whispered a different theory. They suggested that the death was a necessary illusion, a carefully orchestrated stage play designed to allow Perenelle to vanish from the public eye before her unaging appearance became too suspicious to explain. After all, if a woman looks 60 when she should be 90, people start to talk, and talk leads to the stake. Whether she was truly gone or waiting for him in the shadows of another city, Nicholas was left to navigate the world alone, a solitude that lasted for nearly 20 years. He didn't retreat into a shell. Instead, he spent his widowerhood finalizing his legacy, writing extensively and organizing his affairs with the precision of a man who knew exactly when his curtain call was coming. He composed his last will and testament, a document so detailed and generous that it is preserved to this day, leaving virtually all his earthly wealth to the poor, the church, and the hospitals he had founded. He was giving away the gold he had made, scrubbing his hands of the material wealth that had defined his middle years, perhaps preparing his soul for judgment or simply lightening his load for a journey elsewhere. He even designed his own tombstone, a strange and humble slab of marble that he commissioned long before he took his last breath. It didn't depict him as a glorious wizard or a wealthy benefactor. It showed a terrifyingly stark image of his own decomposing corpse, a skeleton barely wrapped in a shroud, with an inscription that pleaded for mercy from Christ. It was a memento mori of the highest order, a final message carved in stone. From earth I came, and to earth I return, a phrase that rings with double meaning for an alchemist who mastered the earth itself. Finally, on March 22nd, 1418, at the ripe old age of roughly 88, a lifespan that was already nearly double the average for that brutal era, Nicholas Flamel died. The city of Paris mourned him deeply. Crowds gathered to pay their respects to the kind old scrivener who had fed the hungry and clothed the naked. He was buried at the church of Saint-Jacques de la Boucherie, placed under the very stone he had designed, near the altar of the Virgin Mary. The heavy slab was slid into place, sealing him in the dark, cold silence of the crypt. The priest chanted, the incense burned, and the book of his life was officially closed. To the world it was the end of a good man, but for those who knew what lay hidden in the cellar of his house, and what was written in the Book of Abraham, the funeral felt less like an ending and more like a sleight of hand. The master was dead, his secrets were buried with him, and the house on Rue des Écrivains stood silent and empty. But almost immediately a strange tension began to build in the city, a collective realization among the greedy and the desperate that the alchemist was gone, but his gold, and perhaps the stone itself, might still be there, waiting for anyone brave enough to break the seal. The man was in the ground, but the hunt was only just beginning. The dirt on Nicholas Flamel's grave hadn't even had time to settle before the vultures began to circle, driven by a greed so consuming that it completely ignored the sanctity of death. Because while the city of Paris had lost a benefactor, the treasure hunters believed they had just gained an opportunity. The public perception of Flamel as a humble scrivener had been slowly eroding for years, replaced by the persistent, glittering rumour that he was sitting on a mountain of alchemical gold, and with the old man finally out of the way, the restraint of the mob evaporated instantly. His house on the Rue des Écrivains became the target of a frantic, chaotic scavenger hunt that was less like an investigation and more like a demolition, as thieves, desperate scholars, and perhaps even agents of the crown broke in to find the source of his inexplicable wealth. They didn't just search the rooms, they dissected them, prying up the wooden floorboards with crowbars, smashing into the plaster of the walls to check for hollow compartments, and digging up the cellar floor in the hopes of finding a buried chest or a hidden laboratory. They were looking for the red stone, the powder of projection that could make them kings. But even more than the gold, they were hunting for the Book of Abraham the Mage, the instruction manual for the universe that Flamel had guarded so jealously for decades. The ransacking was brutal and thorough, leaving the once quiet home in ruins, stripped of furniture and dignity, but to the shock and fury of the looters, the house was clean. There was no secret stash of gold bars, no vials of glowing red liquid, and most frustrating of all, the legendary copper-bound book was nowhere to be found, as if it had dissolved into thin air the moment Flamel took his last breath. The frustration in the streets was palpable, fueling a new and dangerous theory that whispered through the taverns. Perhaps the gold wasn't in the house because Flamel had taken it with him. Or worse, perhaps he wasn't in the grave at all. This suspicion gnawed at the minds of the greedy and the curious alike, leading to one of the most chilling episodes in the legend, a moment where the boundary between history and ghost story blurs completely, under the cover of darkness, driven by the possibility that Flamel had been buried with his secrets, or perhaps just to steal the jewellery from a corpse. A group of men, whether they were common grave robbers or officials conducting a secret inquest remains a matter of debate, entered the church of Saint-Jacques de la Boucherie. They approached the heavy marble slab that Flamel had designed himself, the one with the grim carving of the skeleton, and with tools and gritted teeth, they pried the stone lid off the tomb, expecting to be hit by the smell of decay and the sight of a dead man. But as the torchlight flickered into the dark void of the sepulchre, the men froze in terror and confusion because the grave was empty. There was no body, no bones, no remnants of a decomposition process that should have been well underway. The clothes and the shroud were reportedly there, arranged as if the body had simply evaporated or slipped out of them like smoke. But Nicholas Flamel was gone. This wasn't a case of a body being stolen for medical science, as was common in later centuries. The tomb showed no signs of forced entry prior to their arrival, suggesting something far more impossible. The news of the empty grave spread like wildfire, confirming the wildest suspicions of the believers. Flamel hadn't died. He had succeeded. He had used the elixir of life to rejuvenate his body, staged his own funeral with a log or a bribe to the undertaker, and slipped away into the night to join Perenelle, who was likely waiting for him in Switzerland or Spain, both of them young, rich, and laughing at the world they had left behind. The empty tomb became the catalyst for the immortality myth, transforming Flamel from a successful alchemist into an eternal wanderer, a man who had beaten the ultimate system. The authorities, baffled and embarrassed, could offer no explanation, and the Church, usually quick to condemn such things as heresy, remained strangely silent, perhaps because they too were wondering where their most generous donor had gone. The house was empty, the grave was empty, and Nicholas Flamel had effectively pulled off the greatest vanishing act in human history, leaving behind a legacy of questions that would haunt seekers of the Philosopher's Stone for the next 600 years. He was no longer a man of the 14th century. He had become a timeless enigma, and the sightings of the dead alchemist were about to begin, sparking a global game of Where's Waldo that would span continents and centuries. For nearly 3 centuries, the name of Nicholas Flamel drifted through history like a ghost ship, occasionally spotted but never boarded, until the early 18th century when the legend suddenly dropped anchor in reality with a shocking account that reignited the entire mystery. The year was around 1700, and the man at the centre of this new chapter was not a superstitious peasant, but Paul Lucas, a highly respected French merchant, antiquarian, an official traveller for King Louis XIV, a man whose job was to find hard facts and rare artefacts, not to chase fairy tales. During his travels through the Near East, Lucas stopped in the city of Brusa, in what is now Turkey, a place where the air was thick with spice and the wisdom of the Orient, and there he struck up a conversation with a Uzbek dervish, a man of profound learning who appeared to be in his mid-30s, but spoke with the authority of someone who had lived through epochs. As they sat together, discussing Hermetic philosophy and the great secrets of the universe, the conversation inevitably turned to the subject of alchemy and the philosopher's stone, a topic Lucas treated with the skepticism of a modern European. He mentioned that many great alchemists, including the famous Nicholas Flamel, had died despite their supposed power, expecting the dervish to nod in agreement. Instead, the dervish threw his head back and laughed, a genuine, pitying laugh, and asked Lucas with a smile, "Do you really be so simple as to believe that he is dead?" "No, no, my friend. Nicholas Flamel is alive. Neither he nor his wife Perenelle has yet tasted death." Lucas was stunned into silence as the dervish explained that there are 7 great masters in the world who travel constantly, possessing the secret of longevity, and that he himself was one of them, having recently parted ways with the Flamels in India. The dervish unravelled the mystery of the empty tomb with casual ease, explaining that Nicholas and Perenelle had realised that their immense wealth and lack of ageing were becoming too dangerous in France, where the king would inevitably arrest them to extract their secret. To escape, they devised a brilliant exit strategy. Perenelle faked a mortal illness and her death, escaping to Switzerland while a log was buried in her place, and a few years later, Nicholas followed suit, staging his own demise and leaving behind the empty shell of his life in Paris to join her. The dervish claimed that the couple was currently living in the peaceful obscurity of the East, continuing their studies and watching the world evolve from the shadows. This wasn't just a tavern rumour. Lucas was so shaken and convinced by the dervish's detailed knowledge and sincerity that he included the entire account in his official travelogue published in 1712, Voyage du Sieur Paul Lucas au Levant. The book became an instant sensation in Europe, exploding like a bombshell in the intellectual circles of Paris and London, because it came from a credible source who had nothing to gain by lying. Suddenly the empty grave made perfect sense. It wasn't a robbery, it was a getaway. The story of the dervish transformed Flamel from a historical footnote into an active, living participant in the 18th century, suggesting that the alchemist was not only alive, but was part of a secret global elite of immortals who were quietly pulling the strings of history. It gave hope to every dreamer and madman in Europe that the stone was real, and it set off a fresh wave of hysteria as people began to look for the Flamels in every crowd, convinced that the couple was hiding in plain sight. The dervish had planted a seed that would grow into a forest of sightings, because if Flamel was in India in 1700, where else might he have been? The timeline of his life had just been shattered, and the hunt for the immortal alchemist moved from the graveyards of Paris to the exotic courts of the East, blurring the lines between reality and fiction so thoroughly that even the most rational men began to wonder if death was truly the end for everyone, or just for those who didn't know the secret. If the account of the dervish in Turkey was the spark, the mid-18th century in Paris was the powder keg that exploded the Flamel legend into a full-blown obsession, specifically around the year 1761, when the Enlightenment was supposedly chasing away the shadows of superstition, yet the city was more obsessed with magic than ever before. It was in this atmosphere of decadence, powdered wigs, and secret societies that a new, electrifying rumour swept through the salons of the aristocracy. Nicholas and Perenelle Flamel had returned home. They were reportedly seen attending a performance at the Paris Opera, the social epicentre of the city, not as withered ghosts or ancient relics, but as a striking, radiant couple who appeared to be in the prime of their lives, dressed in fashions that were elegant yet subtly out of step with the current trends, as if they were wearing clothes from a slightly different era or a foreign court. Witnesses described them as possessing a strange magnetic calm, watching the performance with a detached amusement, like adults watching children play a game they had long since outgrown. They were whispered to be incredibly wealthy, paying in gold coins that looked newly minted but bore old dates, and they vanished into the night before anyone could corner them for an introduction. This sighting wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a larger phenomenon involving the enigmatic Count of Saint-Germain, a man who was himself a walking mystery, claiming to be hundreds of years old and to have known Christ personally. Saint-Germain, who charmed King Louis XV and dazzled Madame de Pompadour with diamonds he claimed to have grown in a laboratory, spoke of Nicholas Flamel not as a historical figure from the dusty past, but as a close personal friend and contemporary. In hushed conversations at the Palace of Versailles, Saint-Germain would drop casual anecdotes about dining with the Flamels, claiming that Nicholas was currently in Paris to check on the condition of the hospitals and churches he had funded centuries ago, acting like a conscientious landlord inspecting his properties. He vividly described Flamel's personality, his continued experiments, and his deep sadness at the state of the world, painting a picture of an immortal who was weary but bound by duty to watch over humanity. These stories drove the Parisian elite into a frenzy. They began to scrutinize every stranger, every wealthy foreigner, wondering if they were looking at the Alchemist. The rumour mill went into overdrive when a man claiming to be a descendant of Flamel's neighbours reported seeing the couple walking through the Cemetery of the Innocents in broad daylight, tracing the hieroglyphs on the famous arch with a nostalgic look in their eyes, pointing out details to each other and laughing softly, as if sharing an inside joke about the symbols that were baffling the rest of the world. When approached, they supposedly spoke a form of French that was antiquated, peppered with words that hadn't been used since the days of Joan of Arc, before melting into the crowded market streets, leaving the witness goosebumped and terrified. This era solidified the idea that Flamel was a shapeshifter of sorts, a master of disguise who could be a merchant in India one year and a nobleman in Paris the next, using the Philosopher's Stone not just to prolong life, but to fund a shadowy existence that transcended borders and governments. The 18th century didn't just believe in Flamel, they wanted to be him, and his alleged presence gave credibility to every charlatan selling youth serums in the back alleys of Paris. But while the socialites gossiped, serious occultists realised something more profound. If Flamel was back in Paris, it likely wasn't for the opera. It was because the timeline of history was shifting, revolution was in the air, and perhaps the immortal guardian had returned to witness the fall of the monarchy that had once persecuted his people. Or maybe, just maybe, he was looking for a successor to take the burden of the book off his hands. The sightings of 1761 proved that the legend was no longer about a dead man in a grave. It was about a living presence that haunted the collective consciousness of France, a reminder that some secrets are too powerful to ever truly die. And as the guillotine blades began to be sharpened for the coming revolution, people couldn't help but wonder if the man who cheated death was watching from the crowd, making sure he was on the winning side once again. By the time the 19th century rolled around, the legend of Nicholas Flamel had evolved from a historical curiosity into a full-blown occult obsession, with secret societies across Europe frantically searching for the one physical piece of evidence that could prove everything, the Book of Abraham the Mage. To understand why this search was so desperate in the 1800s, we have to uncover the terrifying and bloody history of what happened to the book after Flamel's disappearance, a chapter of the story that involves the most powerful and ruthless man in French history, Cardinal Richelieu. The trail of the book had gone cold for a long time, hidden perhaps within the walls of the house on Rue des Écrivains, or passed down through a line of unsuspecting descendants who had no idea what they possessed. The story resurfaces with a man named Dubois, a somewhat reckless and naive descendant who allegedly found the book gathering dust in an old chest. Unlike Flamel, who was patient and pious, Dubois was eager for quick riches and made the fatal mistake of performing transmutations in public, flashing his newfound gold to gain favour with the aristocracy. News of a man turning lead into gold travelled straight to the ears of Cardinal Richelieu, the Red Eminence, who effectively ran France with an iron fist and a network of spies that would make the modern CIA look like amateurs. Richelieu was obsessed with alchemy, not for spiritual enlightenment, but for the raw power it could grant the state. He needed infinite gold to fund his wars and consolidate his control over Europe. He didn't ask Dubois politely for the book. He arrested him. Under the brutal interrogation techniques of the time, which likely involved the rack or the water torture, Dubois confessed everything he knew, but the tragedy was that he didn't know enough. He could read a few of the symbols, but lacked the deep understanding that Flamel had spent decades acquiring. Richelieu, unsatisfied and greedy, confiscated the book, and likely ordered the execution of the unfortunate Dubois to tie up loose ends, effectively stealing the legacy of Flamel for the French crown. The cardinal then built a secret state-of-the-art laboratory in the Château de Richelieu, bringing in the most brilliant minds and alchemists of the era to study the text day and night. Imagine the scene: the most powerful man in the world, surrounded by bubbling retorts and ancient manuscripts, staring furiously at the drawings of the dragons and the old man with the scythe, completely baffled by the code Flamel had left behind. The irony was palpable. Richelieu had the book, he had the resources, and he had the ambition, but he lacked the purity of heart and the key that Master Canches had given Flamel. The book refused to yield its secrets to a tyrant. When Richelieu died in 1642, the book was reportedly found in his private library, a silent witness to his failure. But in the chaos that followed his death, and the subsequent transfer of power, the volume vanished once again. Some say it was stolen by Richelieu's secretary, others claim it was cut into pieces and distributed among different libraries to prevent anyone from having the full recipe, and a few believe it was returned to the Flamel family by a loyal servant. This lost years period fueled the frantic hunt of the 19th century, where men like the famous occultist Eliphas Levi claimed to have seen copies of the figures, and rumours circulated that the original book had been spotted in a dusty antique shop in Paris, sold for a pittance to a stranger who recognised its cover. This turned every bookstore in Paris into a potential gold mine. Scholars and madmen alike spent their lives pulling dusty volumes off shelves, praying to see the copper binding and the bark-like pages. The 19th century became the era of the paper chase, where the mystery wasn't just about where Flamel was, but where his manual was hiding. If Richelieu couldn't crack it, who could? And more importantly, if the book was still out there, did it mean that someone else was currently using it, creating a new generation of immortals right under the nose of the Industrial Revolution? While the Romantics and the occultists of the 19th century were chasing ghosts and rumours, a far more shocking validation of Nicholas Flamel's work was sitting in a wooden chest in England, hidden within the private papers of the man who defined modern science, Sir Isaac Newton. We are taught in school that Newton was the father of physics, the rational genius who discovered gravity, invented calculus, and unravelled the laws of motion, effectively banishing magic from the world in favour of cold, hard mathematics. But this image is a carefully curated lie that was shattered in 1936, when a massive collection of Newton's private journals was sold at Sotheby's auction house, revealing a secret life that shocked the scientific community to its core. These papers proved that Newton was not the first of the Age of Reason, but rather, as the economist John Maynard Keynes famously put it, the last of the magicians. It turns out that Newton wrote more than 1 million words on alchemy, far more than he ever wrote on physics, and at the very centre of his obsession was none other than Nicholas Flamel. Newton didn't just read Flamel's works, He studied them with the intensity of a forensic scientist, believing that the French bookseller had possessed the Prisca Sapientia, the ancient original wisdom that had been lost to mankind. Among Newton's papers were found extensive handwritten translations of Flamel's The Book of Hieroglyphic Figures, copied out in Newton's own precise script, along with detailed annotations where he tried to decode the allegories of the dragons and the serpents, using his knowledge of chemistry and laboratory experimentation. Imagine the scene. The man who calculated the orbits of the planets was spending his nights locked in his Cambridge laboratory, surrounded by furnaces and toxic fumes, trying to replicate the exact recipe Flamel had described 300 years earlier. Newton was convinced that Flamel's description of the ferment and the vegetable spirit was the key to understanding the very nature of matter itself, a force that could not only transmute metals, but perhaps explain gravity, an invisible force that acted at a distance, much like the alchemical powder. He took Flamel's cryptic instructions about the doves of Diana and the green lion and treated them as rigorous scientific data, cross-referencing them with his own experiments on optics and the spectrum of light. It is a mind-bending realization that the Optics, one of the most important scientific books ever written, may have been partially inspired by Flamel's descriptions of the changing colours in the alchemical flask, the black, the white, the yellow, and the red. Newton's obsession confirms that the smartest man who ever lived did not view Flamel as a fraud or a writer of fairy tales. He viewed him as a peer, a successful predecessor who had cracked the code that Newton was desperately trying to solve. This connection gives the Flamel legend a terrifying weight of credibility, because if Isaac Newton, a man who was never easily fooled and who demanded proof for everything, believed that Flamel had found the stone, then we have to ask ourselves what he saw in those texts that we are missing. The discovery of these papers in the 20th century forced historians to rewrite the biography of Newton and, by extension, the history of science, admitting that the foundations of modern chemistry were built on the ruins of alchemy. Newton's failure to replicate Flamel's success wasn't for a lack of trying. He died with high levels of mercury in his body, a martyr to the same dangerous quest that Flamel had supposedly survived. This link bridges the gap between the medieval world of magic and the modern world of atoms, suggesting that Flamel wasn't just a wizard, but a primitive quantum physicist who stumbled upon a way to manipulate the building blocks of reality long before we had the vocabulary to describe it. It turns the story from a folklore legend into a cold case file that the greatest minds of humanity have been trying to crack for centuries, and it raises the stakes significantly. If Newton believed it was real, then the Philosopher's Stone isn't just a myth. It's a lost technology waiting to be rediscovered. As the timeline shifts into the blood-soaked chapters of the 20th century, the hunt for Nicholas Flamel's legacy underwent a terrifying transformation, moving from the private studies of eccentrics like Newton into the cold, bureaucratic machinery of the world's most dangerous totalitarian regime. When World War II erupted, it wasn't just a battle for territory. It was a war of ideologies, and deep within the Nazi hierarchy, specifically under the command of Reichsfuhrer SS Heinrich Himmler, there was a dedicated branch known as the Ahnenerbe, or the Ancestral Heritage Research and Teaching Society. While often depicted in pop culture as cartoonish villains hunting for the Ark of the Covenant, the reality was far more disturbing and organised. The Ahnenerbe was comprised of scientists, archaeologists and historians who were tasked with proving the superiority of the Aryan race through occult and archaeological evidence, and high on their priority list was the recovery of ancient superweapons and lost knowledge, including the secrets of alchemy. Himmler was obsessed with the idea that the ancient alchemists like Flamel possessed a technology that had been lost, a method of transmutation that could not only create infinite gold to fund the Third Reich's war machine, but could also unlock the secrets of immortality for the elite SS officer corps. When the German tanks rolled into Paris in June 1940, occupying the city where Flamel had lived and worked, special commando units weren't just securing government buildings, They were raiding the archives of the Bibliothèque Nationale and the secret vaults of the Masonic lodges. They were hunting for the original manuscripts of the Book of Abraham the Mage and any uncatalogued papers of Flamel that might have survived the centuries. It is a matter of historical record that the Nazis looted vast collections of occult literature, shipping trainloads of books back to Germany for analysis in their secret castles, like Wewelsburg, which Himmler intended to be the centre of the New World. The Nazis understood something that the rest of the world was only just beginning to grasp, that alchemy was not magic, but a primitive understanding of atomic energy. The concept of the Philosopher's Stone, a substance that could change one element into another, is scientifically identical to nuclear fission, the process of splitting the atom to release massive amounts of energy and change the atomic structure of matter. There is a chilling theory among researchers that the Nazi quest for the atomic bomb and their quest for alchemical texts were parallel projects, fueled by the belief that Flamel had discovered a low-tech way to trigger nuclear reactions. While the Americans were building the Manhattan Project in the desert, the Nazis were scouring medieval texts for a shortcut, believing that the red powder of Flamel was perhaps a metaphor for a radioactive isotope or a catalyst that could bypass the need for massive cyclotrons. The trail gets even murkier when we look at the involvement of Allied intelligence agencies. As the war drew to a close and the Operation Paperclip race began to grab Nazi scientists, the OSS, the precursor to the CIA, was also interested in the occult research the Germans had conducted. They didn't just want the rocket scientists, they wanted the files from the Ahnenerbe. This marked the moment when the search for Flamel went completely black, vanishing into the classified files of intelligence agencies who realised that if the stone existed, it was a weapon of mass destruction. The 20th century proved that the government interest in Flamel was not about history or curiosity. It was about power. If a man in the 14th century figured out how to manipulate matter at an atomic level using only a furnace and a book, then that knowledge was more dangerous than a hydrogen bomb. The Nazis may have failed to find the physical book, or perhaps they found it and couldn't read it, but their obsession proved that the powers that be took the legend very seriously. The smoke from the Alchemist's furnace had been replaced by the mushroom cloud, but the underlying principle remained exactly the same, the mastery of nature's fundamental building blocks. And in the chaos of the post-war world amidst the rubble of Europe, whispers began to circulate that the Book of Abraham had surfaced again, not in a library, but on the black market, moving through the hands of shadowy figures who knew that the highest bidder wasn't a museum, but a government. The most chilling piece of evidence that the line of Nicholas Flamel didn't end in the Middle Ages comes from the 20th century, specifically through the existence of a phantom figure known as Fulcanelli, a man often called the last alchemist. In the paranoid and scientifically explosive atmosphere of the 1920s and 30s, Fulcanelli appeared in Paris as a master adept, an aristocratic and incredibly learned individual whose true identity was never revealed, but whose knowledge terrified the scientific elite. He wrote a masterpiece called The Mystery of the Cathedrals, which explicitly claimed that the Gothic cathedrals of France, the very ones Flamel had funded and decorated, were actually stone books containing the secret of the apocalypse and the atomic structure of the universe. But the story takes a turn into the Twilight Zone in June 1937, 2 years before the outbreak of World War II, when Fulcanelli arranged a secret meeting with a young physicist named Jacques Bergier in a laboratory of the gas board in Paris. At this time, nuclear physics was in its infancy. The neutron had only just been discovered, and the idea of an atomic bomb was still theoretical science fiction. Yet, during this meeting, the mysterious alchemist dropped a bombshell that would haunt Bergier for the rest of his life. Fulcanelli warned him, and by extension the scientific community, about the reckless path they were treading, stating with absolute authority that the alchemists of old had already discovered the secret of splitting the atom centuries ago. He told Bergier, "The geometric arrangement of the atom is not what you think it is. The liberation of atomic energy is easier than you think, and the radioactivity produced can poison the atmosphere of our entire planet for years." He described nuclear reactors and the horrific burns of radiation sickness with a precision that was impossible for anyone in 1937 to know unless they had seen it before. Bergier was stunned, asking the obvious question: if the alchemists knew this, why did they keep it secret? Fulcanelli replied that they had realized the danger was too great for humanity to handle, that the great work was not just about making gold, but about the liberation of the spirit, and that giving nuclear fire to primitive men would only lead to destruction. This conversation implies that Nicholas Flamel didn't just find a way to get rich. He found a way to manipulate the fundamental energy of the cosmos, and then, realizing its destructive potential, buried the knowledge under layers of symbols and silence to protect the future. The connection becomes even more spine-tingling when we look at the hunt that followed. After the liberation of Paris in 1944, the American OSS, the predecessor to the CIA, launched a frantic manhunt for Fulcanelli. They weren't looking for a magician. They were looking for a nuclear scientist who knew more than Einstein. The major in charge of the operation had orders to find this master alchemist and bring him to the United States, likely to pick his brain for the Manhattan Project or to prevent the Soviets from getting him. But just like Flamel before him, Fulcanelli had vanished into thin air. He was never found, leaving behind only his books and the testimony of the physicists he had warned. Many esoteric researchers are convinced that Fulcanelli was not a new adept, but was actually Nicholas Flamel himself, continuing his eternal watch over the progress of science, stepping out of the shadows only when humanity was about to destroy itself. The description of Fulcanelli, an old man who looked surprisingly vigorous, spoke with an antiquated accent, and possessed infinite wealth and knowledge, fits the profile of the immortal scrivener perfectly. If true, it means Flamel was there when we split the atom, shaking his head in sorrow as we opened the box he had spent 600 years trying to keep closed. The Fulcanelli incident bridges the gap between the candlelit laboratories of the 14th century and the Cold War silos of the 20th, suggesting that the Philosopher's Stone and the uranium core are just two different names for the same terrifying power, and that Flamel is the only human being who ever learned how to handle it without burning the world down. Although the original copper-bound artifact that started this entire saga has been missing for centuries, we are not left entirely in the dark, because before it vanished, Nicholas Flamel did something that ensured the survival of its contents. He copied the figures. These illustrations, which have been reproduced in various manuscripts and later printed in the 17th century, provide us with a fascinating, albeit confusing window into the mind of the alchemist and the specific instructions he was following. To the uninitiated, the Book of Abraham the Mage looks like a collection of fever dreams or surrealist art, populated by dragons, angels, and snakes. But to a chemist, it is a rigorous laboratory notebook written in code. The most famous image is arguably that of the crucified serpent, a snake nailed to a cross. In the language of alchemy, the snake or dragon usually represents mercury, the volatile liquid metal that is difficult to grasp, and the cross represents the concept of fixation or solidification. So, a crucified serpent isn't a religious blasphemy. It is a chemical instruction to fix the volatile, to take the liquid mercury and process it until it becomes a stable solid, which is the first essential step in creating the stone. Another key image shows a desert with 4 springs flowing into 4 rivers, and on the ground there are snakes crawling in every direction. This likely represents the prima materia, or first matter in its chaotic state, the raw stuff of creation before it is purified. Flamel wrote that these serpents had to be seized and stripped of their poison, a metaphor for the dangerous process of purifying the initial ingredients, likely involving the removal of toxic impurities like arsenic or lead from the ore. Then there is the terrifying image of the massacre of the innocents, a biblical scene of soldiers killing babies, which Flamel included in his arch. While this looks like a pious reference to the New Testament, in alchemical terms, the innocents represent the pure white matter that must be harvested from the blackened, putrefied darkness of the Negrido stage. The blood being spilled is the spiritus mundi, or the universal spirit released during the reaction. Modern chemists who have analysed these texts suggest that Flamel was describing a wet way of alchemy, a slow, safer process of distillation and circulation, as opposed to the dangerous dry way which involves high heat and crucibles. The book also utilised what is known as the language of the birds, or the green language, a phonetic code where the sound of the words matters more than their spelling, creating puns and double meanings that would fly right over the head of a casual reader. For example, a drawing of a rose might not be a flower, but a reference to ros as dew, a crucial collection of atmospheric moisture used in the process. The complexity of these diagrams suggests that the Book of Abraham was not a magic spell book, but a multi-layered encryption system designed to be uncrackable by anyone who lacked the specific key that Master Kanchas provided. It forces us to respect Flamel not just as a mystic, but as a master cryptographer who turned chemistry into a visual narrative, ensuring that the recipe for the Philosopher's Stone was preserved in a format that could transcend language barriers and time itself, waiting for a mind sharp enough to connect the dots between the dragon, the blood, and the gold. For centuries, modern science mocked the alchemists as deluded dreamers stirring pots of urine and wishful thinking. But in the 20th century, the laughter stopped abruptly, because physicists realised that Nicholas Flamel wasn't breaking the laws of nature, he was just anticipating them by about 600 years. We now know for a fact that transmutation, the changing of one element into another, is absolutely real, and it happens every day in the stars above our heads and in the nuclear reactors we build on Earth. The atomic number of mercury is 80, and the atomic number of gold is 79, meaning they are neighbours on the periodic table, separated by a single proton. To turn mercury into gold, you don't need magic, you just need to knock that one proton out of the nucleus. In 1980, the Nobel Prize-winning physicist Glenn Seaborg actually did this at the Lawrence Berkeley Laboratory, using a particle accelerator to transmute several thousand atoms of bismuth into gold. However, there was a massive catch. The process required hideous amounts of energy, a machine the size of a building, and the resulting gold was microscopic and radioactive, costing trillions of dollars per ounce to produce. This is where the mystery of Flamel becomes truly aggravating for scientists. If transmutation is possible, but requires the energy of a star, how did a medieval scrivener achieve it in a fireplace with glass beakers and a coal fire? This discrepancy leads to the fascinating theory that the Philosopher's Stone was not a magical gem, but a supreme catalyst, a substance that lowers the energy barrier required for nuclear reactions to occur, effectively allowing for low-energy nuclear reactions, LEN, or what was controversially called cold fusion. In chemistry, a catalyst speeds up a reaction without being consumed by it. If Flamel found a chemical agent, perhaps a super-heavy stable element, or an exotic isotope found in the prima materia that could disrupt the nuclear binding forces of mercury at room temperature, he could theoretically facilitate the proton shed without a cyclotron. This aligns perfectly with the descriptions of the red powder, which was said to be incredibly heavy for its size and capable of transmuting thousands of times its own weight. If Flamel discovered a chemical backdoor into the nucleus of the atom, a way to bypass the Coulomb barrier using geometry and chemical resonance rather than brute force, he didn't just find gold, he found the holy grail of physics. This would explain why the secret had to be kept so deadly quiet. Imagine if a substance existed that could easily rearrange atomic structures. It wouldn't just make gold, it could turn lead into uranium, or water into poison, or destabilize matter entirely. The stone would be the ultimate dual-use technology, capable of solving all resource scarcity or destroying the planet. Therefore, the scientific defense of Flamel argues that he was a primitive empirical observer who stumbled upon a natural phenomenon that we have yet to rediscover because we're too focused on smashing atoms with hammers rather than unlocking them with keys. It implies that somewhere in the chaotic, dangerous recipes of the Book of Abraham, hidden between the dragons and the angels, lies a formula for a catalyst that could render our entire energy infrastructure obsolete overnight, proving that the gap between magic and advanced science is merely a matter of understanding the mechanism. While the transmutation of lead into gold captures the imagination of the greedy, the true holy grail of alchemy was always the biological application of the stone, the elixir of life, or the panacea universal. For Flamel, the logic was perfectly consistent. If the red stone could cure the imperfections of base metals, turning the sick lead into healthy gold, then it could logically do the same for the corruptions of the human body, curing the ultimate disease known as aging. The alchemical theory of health wasn't about balancing humours, but about purification. They believed that death was the result of the accumulation of impurities and the breakdown of the body's internal fire. The elixir wasn't just a vitamin supplement. It was described as a substance that would induce a violent, terrifying, and total system reboot. Historical texts on the elixir describe a process that sounds less like healing and more like a horror movie transformation. The user would supposedly lose their hair, their teeth, and their fingernails. Their skin would peel away like a snake shedding its scales, and then, miraculously, everything would grow back new, pristine, and young. It was a cellular reset button, a solvet coagula applied to flesh and bone. If Flamel and Perronel actually took the elixir, they wouldn't have just stopped aging. They would have endured a period of agonizing regeneration, emerging from their laboratory not just rich, but biologically distinct from the rest of the human race. Modern science might actually have a name for this. It sounds suspiciously like an extreme version of telomere repair or the flushing of senescent cells, concepts that are at the cutting edge of longevity research today. We are currently spending billions trying to figure out how to tell our cells to stop dying, to reset the biological clock, and here is a legend from the 14th century describing exactly that process. The elixir didn't grant invulnerability. If you cut Flamel's head off, he would still die. But it granted immortality, the ability to exist indefinitely as long as the body was maintained and the supply of the elixir was replenished. This distinction is crucial because it means Flamel and Perronel would have to live in a state of constant vigilance, protecting their physical bodies from accidents and violence while carrying the secret supply of the medicine that kept the Reaper at bay. It transforms their existence from a fairy tale into a high-stakes survival thriller, where they are trapped in bodies that refuse to die, watching their friends, their children, if they had any, and their entire world crumble to dust while they remain frozen in time. The elixir was the ultimate gift, but it was also the ultimate cage, separating them from the natural cycle of life and death, forcing them to become eternal observers, forever young but burdened with the ancient memories of a world that has long since moved on. Just when you think the rabbit hole of Nicholas Flamel ends at alchemy, the story takes a sharp right turn into the world of shadow governments and secret societies, specifically surfacing in the 1960s within the dusty archives of the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris. It was here that researchers discovered the Dossier Secret d'Henri Lobineau, a collection of strange typed documents that allegedly reveal the history of the Priory of Sion, a secret order founded in the 11th century to protect the bloodline of Jesus Christ and the truth of the Holy Grail. These documents contained a list of the order's Grand Masters, or Nortoniers, a roll call of history's most brilliant and enigmatic minds, including Leonardo da Vinci, Isaac Newton, and Victor Hugo. But right there, listed as the 8th Grand Master, holding the reins of the organisation from 1398 until his supposed death in 1418, was Nicholas Flamel. This revelation, which later became the backbone of Dan Brown's The Da Vinci Code, completely reframes who Flamel was. If these documents are to be believed, he wasn't just a lone wizard cooking chemicals in a basement. He was the CEO of the most powerful secret society in Europe, a political and spiritual leader entrusted with secrets that could topple the Vatican. It suggests that his massive wealth might not have come from transmutation at all, but rather from the Knights Templar treasure or the vast coffers of the Priory, which he was laundering through his alchemical success to hide the true source of the funds. This theory aligns disturbingly well with his life. He was a scrivener, perfect for forging documents or keeping records. He was incredibly wealthy without a clear business explanation, and he funded churches, the perfect cover for a group trying to infiltrate or monitor the church. Being the Grand Master would also explain why he had access to the Book of Abraham in the first place. Perhaps it wasn't a chance purchase for 2 florins, but an heirloom passed down to him by the previous master, a baton of knowledge that came with the job title. It also gives a darker context to his fake death. If he was the head of an order protecting the Holy Grail, his disappearance might have been a tactical retreat to protect the bloodline, or to move the order's headquarters underground, as the political climate in France became more dangerous. While many historians now regard the dossier secrets as an elaborate hoax by a man named Pierre Plantard, the fact remains that whoever fabricated the list chose Flamel as a cornerstone. They recognised that in the collective psyche of Europe, Flamel is the ultimate keeper of secrets, the bridge between the magical and the real. Whether he was truly the Grand Master, or just a figurehead for later conspiracy theorists, the connection places Flamel at the very centre of the secret history of the world, suggesting that his immortality wasn't just about living forever, but about guarding a truth that was vital for the future of humanity, a mission so important that he couldn't afford the luxury of dying. For the vast majority of the modern world, specifically the generation raised on magic and boarding schools, the name Nicholas Flamel doesn't conjure images of dusty medieval manuscripts or secret societies, but rather a specific scene in a library at Hogwarts where Hermione Granger slams a massive book onto a table and exclaims, "I found him!" It is impossible to tell the story of the Alchemist without acknowledging the massive global resurrection of his fame caused by J.K. Rowling and Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone. Before 1997, Flamel was a niche figure known only to historians, occultists, and conspiracy theorists. But Rowling took this obscure French scrivener and propelled him into the stratosphere of pop culture, making him a household name for millions of children and adults alike. What is fascinating is that Rowling didn't just invent a character to fit her plot. She borrowed the real man, and she did her homework with frightening accuracy. In the book, Flamel is described as celebrating his 665th birthday, a number that, if you do the math based on the timeline of the book, set in the early 1990s, and Flamel's actual birth year of roughly 1330, is remarkably consistent with his real age if he had never died. She kept Perenelle by his side, depicting them as a devoted couple living a quiet life in Devon, which aligns perfectly with the historical accounts of their deep partnership and the legends of their retreat to obscurity. By weaving him into the wizarding world as a close friend of Dumbledore, she bridged the gap between the mythic past and her fantasy present. But the unintended side effect was that she unleashed a tidal wave of tourism and curiosity upon the real physical locations in Paris that are connected to him. Suddenly, the Rue de Montmorency wasn't just a quiet street, it became a pilgrimage site. At number 51 Rue de Montmorency stands the Auberge Nicholas Flamel, a house that Flamel actually built in 1407 to house the poor. It is officially the oldest stone house in Paris, a rugged ancient structure that survived wars, revolutions and modernization. Because of the Harry Potter phenomenon, this building, which is now a high-end restaurant, became a mecca for fans who wanted to touch the same stones that the Alchemist touched. They come expecting magic wands, but they find a very real, very solid piece of history that proves the man was not a fiction. Even more incredible is the journey of his tombstone. After the violation of his grave and the realization that it was empty, the tombstone he designed, the one with the skeletal corpse and the plea for mercy, didn't just stay in the church. In a twist of fate that Flamel might have found hilarious, the heavy marble slab was eventually removed from the church and lost for years, only to be rediscovered in the 19th century in a grocery shop on the Rue Saint-Jacques, where the grocer was using the priceless artifact as a cutting board for chopping spinach and herbs. The wear and tear on the stone from the grocer's knife is a poetic insult to the man who mastered the scythe of time. Today, that tombstone sits in the Musée de Cluny, the National Museum of the Middle Ages in Paris, and thanks to the Potter-fueled resurgence, it is one of the most visited artifacts in the collection. People stand before it, staring at the empty eyes of the carved skeleton, wondering if the man who commissioned it is actually dead, or if he's laughing at them from a beach in Havana or a cottage in Devon. Pop culture didn't create the legend of Nicholas Flamel, but it acted as a massive amplifier, a modern form of alchemy that turned a forgotten historical footnote into a global icon, proving that even if he didn't find the elixir of life, he certainly found the formula for eternal fame, which is the next best thing. We spend our entire lives terrified of the end, frantically searching for creams, diets, and technologies to buy us just a few more years. But if we stop to consider the reality of Nicholas Flamel's alleged success, we have to confront the terrifying possibility that the Philosopher's Stone wasn't a blessing, but a curse of the highest order. The fantasy of immortality is always painted in gold and sunshine, endless time to learn every language, read every book, and travel to every corner of the earth. But the reality would likely be a psychological horror story of isolation and profound loss. If Flamel is truly alive today, he is a man out of time, a shipwreck survivor clinging to the wreckage of the 14th century while the ocean of history churns around him. Think about the emotional toll of watching every single person you have ever loved wither and die, while your own reflection in the mirror remains stubbornly unchanged. He would have buried not just his parents and his friends, but generations of descendants, watching his own bloodline dilute and vanish until he was a stranger to his own kin. To survive the heartbreak, he would have to shut off his humanity, becoming a cold, detached observer who refuses to make deep connections because he knows that human lives are as fleeting as mayflies compared to his timeline. He's not just an immortal, he's an eternal refugee, forced to live in the shadows, constantly looking over his shoulder, never staying in one city for more than a generation lest the neighbours notice that he hasn't aged a day. He can never have a permanent home, a stable career, or a true identity. He's a ghost who must constantly reinvent himself, changing names, forging documents, and fabricating backstories, just to exist without being dissected by a government lab or worshipped by a cult. Imagine the sheer, crushing boredom of having seen it all before. He watched the rise and fall of Napoleon, the Industrial Revolution, the horrors of 2 world wars, and the birth of the internet, and by now the repetitive cycles of human stupidity and violence must be agonizing to witness. History doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes, and Flamel has heard this song 1,000 times. Furthermore, the world he was born into, a world of faith, handwritten letters, and silence, is dead, replaced by a loud, digital surveillance state that makes hiding almost impossible. In the 14th century, you could move to the next village and disappear. Today, with facial recognition, biometric passports, and digital footprints, remaining a ghost requires a level of paranoia and technical sophistication that would be exhausting to maintain. There is also the burden of the secret itself. He holds the solution to the world's energy crisis and the cure for all diseases in his pocket, yet he cannot share it because he knows that humanity is too immature to handle it without destroying itself. He is forced to watch millions die of cancer and starvation, knowing he could save them but choosing not to, a moral weight that would crush the soul of a saint. The only thing that makes this nightmare bearable is the presence of Perenelle. If the legend is true and they are together, then they are a binary star system, 2 souls orbiting each other in the void, the only 2 beings in the universe who can truly understand the other's burden. They are the only constants in a variable universe. But what if she died? What if the elixir failed her, or an accident took her, leaving him truly alone for the last few centuries? That level of solitude is a fate worse than death. So when we look at the empty grave and the golden legacy, we shouldn't just feel envy. We should feel a shudder of pity. Nicholas Flamel may have defeated the Grim Reaper, but in doing so he sentenced himself to a life sentence in the prison of time, proving that the only thing more tragic than a life that ends too soon is a life that never ends at all. So, where is he right now? If we accept the premise that Nicholas Flamel cracked the code of mortality, we are left with the maddening game of hide and seek that has encompassed the entire globe. forcing us to ask how a man born in the Middle Ages could possibly navigate the surveillance state of the 21st century. In a world of facial recognition, biometric passports, and digital footprints, the old trick of simply moving to the next town and changing your name doesn't work anymore, which suggests that if Flamel is still here, he has evolved into a master of modern camouflage. One popular theory among esoteric circles is that he has retreated from the chaotic surface world entirely, finding sanctuary in the legendary hidden cities of the East, like Shambhala or Agartha, places that exist on a vibrational frequency that satellite imagery cannot capture, living in a conclave of other invisible masters who guide humanity's spiritual evolution from the safety of the Himalayas. It's a romantic notion, painting him as a monk in robes meditating on a snowy peak, but it ignores the practical reality of who Flamel was. He was a businessman, a Parisian, a man who loved the hustle of the city and the smell of ink and commerce. A far more compelling and unsettling theory suggests that he is right here, embedded in the heart of our modern infrastructure, perhaps hiding in plain sight as a quiet, unassuming figure in a profession that allows him to remain invisible yet informed. A librarian in a massive archives basement, an antique book restorer in London, or a night shift actuary who crunches numbers and avoids eye contact. Or, conversely, we must consider the terrifying power of compound interest. If Flamel invested even a fraction of his gold wisely in the 14th century and let it grow for 600 years, he would not just be rich. He would be the wealthiest entity on the planet, possessing a fortune that dwarfs the GDP of entire nations. This leads to the shadow elite theory, the idea that Flamel and Perronel are the silent architects behind the massive global shifts we see today, pulling strings from within the fortified boardrooms of shell corporations, funding the sudden explosion in longevity research, AI, and space travel. Is it a coincidence that Silicon Valley is currently obsessed with solving death and extending human life? Or is it possible that the oldest man in the world is secretly guiding the new tech billionaires, slowly dripping the technology of the elixir into modern science, disguising alchemy as biotechnology? He could be the silent backer behind the Svalbard Global Seed Vault, ensuring that the ingredients for the work survive the next apocalypse. Or he could be living in a hyper-secure bunker in the Swiss Alps, surrounded by servers instead of crucibles. But the most effective hiding spot is always the most obvious one. He could be the elderly neighbour down the street who tends to his rose garden with obsessive care, the one who never seems to get sick, who tells stories that are just a little too detailed to be second-hand, and who has a wife that looks at him with a depth of familiarity that spans centuries. The brilliance of his disguise is that we are looking for a wizard, but he is playing the role of a nobody. He has had 6 centuries to perfect the art of being boring, of blending into the background noise of civilization so perfectly that you might have walked past him in the subway yesterday and never looked twice. The manuscript is gone, the gold is hidden, and the trail has gone cold. But the possibility remains that the man who defeated death is currently watching this video on a smartphone, smiling softly to himself because we are still getting the details wrong. He is the ultimate anomaly, a glitch in the matrix of mortality, and as long as there is a shadow to stand in, Nicholas Flamel will never be found. So here we are at the end of the road, standing at the edge of the open grave, looking down into the darkness where a body should be, but isn't. The story of Nicholas Flamel is more than just a historical whodunit or a magical fantasy. It is the ultimate mirror held up to human ambition. We are obsessed with this scrivener not because we care about medieval chemistry, but because he represents the one thing we all secretly desire and simultaneously fear, the conquest of our own expiration date. He is the man who cheated the house, the player who beat the game, and whether his story is a literal fact or a magnificent metaphor, the result is the same. He challenges us to ask the most dangerous question of all. If you were walking down a dusty street in Paris, and a desperate stranger offered you an old, copper-bound book full of incomprehensible symbols, would you buy it? And more importantly, if you managed to crack the code, if you held the red powder in your hand that could turn your kitchen table into gold and keep your heart beating forever, would you actually take it? Because the price of the Philosopher's Stone isn't just the charcoal and the mercury. The price is your humanity. It is the willingness to become an island in a river of time, to watch everything you know wash away while you remain a silent, lonely statue. Perhaps the reason Flamel vanished wasn't to hide from the king, but to hide from the heartbreak of a world that refuses to stop changing. Maybe the greatest alchemical trick he ever pulled wasn't turning lead into gold, but turning a simple life into an eternal legend, proving that as long as we are still talking about him, he is not truly dead. The empty tomb in the church of Saint-Jacques de la Boucherie is a blank page, and for 600 years we have been writing our own hopes and fears upon it. Whether he is dust in the wind or sipping espresso in a cafe in Buenos Aires, Nicholas Flamel has achieved what every artist, every king, and every scientist has ever strived for. He has become unforgettable. So, the next time you see an old couple walking hand in hand, looking at the world with eyes that seem a little too wise and a little too sad, take a second look. You never know who or what you might be looking at. The book might be lost, the laboratory might be gone, but the mystery is immortal. Thanks for watching, guys. If you want to join the hunt for the truth, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments. If you had the elixir of life, would you drink it, or would you pour it down the drain? I'll see you in the next one, or maybe I'll see you in 600 years.